Margaret Ellis heard the doorbell just as the evening light turned golden outside her living room window. The quiet house barely reacted to the sound, as if it too had grown used to silence. She sat in her armchair holding a warm cup of chamomile tea, watching dust float slowly through the sunlight. For a moment she considered ignoring the bell. Few people visited anymore, and unexpected knocks usually meant salespeople or delivery mistakes. Still, the bell rang again, sharper this time. Pulling her out of thought, she placed her cup carefully on the table and stood up, her knees reminding her of her age as she walked toward the door. Margaret was 59, tall with soft gray hair, tied loosely behind her head. Life had once moved quickly around her: family dinners, conversations, laughter, but now every movement felt slower, quieter. Since her husband Daniel passed away 3 years earlier, evenings had become long stretches of stillness she filled with routines. Just to avoid thinking too much, she opened the door halfway, unsure of what to expect. A young man stood on the porch holding a large grocery box. He looked slightly out of breath, strands of dark hair falling across his forehead. His delivery jacket was damped from the cool autumn air, and his expression carried a polite but genuine smile. "Delivery for Margaret Ellis?" he asked. His voice sounded warm, not rushed like most delivery workers she had met before. "Yes, that's me," she replied, surprised. She didn't remember ordering anything that day. "I'm Ethan," he said. "The store sent a replacement order. They said some items were missing from your last delivery." Margaret blinked, trying to recall. Earlier that week, she had complained about missing groceries, but she never expected anyone to actually follow through. Most companies apologized and moved on. "Well, that's very kind," she said, stepping aside. "You can bring it in." Ethan carefully carried the box into the house. As he entered, he glanced around naturally, not in a nosy way, but with quiet curiosity. The home was neat and cozy, decorated with soft colors and old wooden furniture that showed years of care. Photographs covered the walls: birthdays, vacations, family gatherings frozen in happier times. Margaret noticed him looking at one particular photo, her wedding portrait. She stood beside Daniel, both smiling brightly, unaware of how fast decades would pass. "My husband," she said softly, almost automatically. Ethan nodded respectfully. "You both look happy." "We were," she replied, her voice calm but heavy with memory. He placed the box on the kitchen counter and began unloading items to check the order. Unlike other delivery workers, he didn't rush. He handled each item carefully, organizing them as if he genuinely wanted to help rather than finish quickly. Margaret watched him quietly. There was something comforting about his presence, something steady. Young people usually carried restless energy, but Ethan seemed patient, grounded. "You have a nice kitchen," he said. "Feels peaceful." She smiled faintly. "It used to be loud. My husband loved cooking. He made a mess every time." Ethan laughed lightly. "That sounds like my dad." "My mom still complains about it." The simple conversation surprised her. She realized she hadn't spoken casually with someone new in a long time. Most conversations these days were short: cashiers, doctors, neighbors waving from a distance. "Do you live around here?" she asked. "About 10 minutes away," he said. "I do deliveries during the day and photography classes in the evening." "Photography?" she asked, interested. "Yeah, I like capturing real moments. People when they're not posing. That's when they look most honest." Margaret considered his words. Honest moments. She wondered what a camera would see if it captured her life now, a woman sitting alone in a quiet house, pretending she was fine. Ethan finished arranging the groceries and wiped his hands lightly on his jacket. "Everything should be correct this time." "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to organize it." He shrugged. "Didn't mind. My grandmother says helping someone properly saves them energy later." The mention of his grandmother softened Margaret's expression. "She sounds wise." "She is," he replied with a grin. She says houses remember people who laugh inside them. The sentence landed gently but deeply in Margaret's heart. She looked around her kitchen, suddenly aware of how long it had been since laughter filled the space. Before she realized it, she said, "This house remembers a lot." Their eyes met briefly, and Ethan seemed to understand more than she had actually said. There was no awkward sympathy, only quiet respect. "Well," he said after a moment, "I should get going. Lots of deliveries left." Margaret walked him to the door. The cool air slipped inside as he stepped onto the porch. "Thank you again," she said. He hesitated slightly, then smiled. "If you ever get another missing order, I hope I'm the one assigned again." She laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised even her. The sound felt unfamiliar but pleasant, like rediscovering an old song. "I'll keep that in mind," she replied. Ethan waved and walked toward his van. Margaret watched as he drove away, the vehicle disappearing slowly down the quiet street lined with maple trees. Shedding orange leaves, she closed the door and stood still for a moment. The house felt different, not louder, not fuller, just warmer, as if a small window had opened somewhere inside her chest. She shook her head gently, telling herself she was overthinking. It was only a delivery, a polite young man doing his job. Nothing more. In the kitchen, she began putting groceries away. She noticed he had arranged everything neatly, heavier items at the back, fragile ones carefully separated. The thoughtfulness made her smile again. As evening deepened, Margaret prepared dinner instead of heating leftovers like usual. She chopped vegetables slowly, humming without realizing it. The simple act of cooking felt meaningful again. Later, she carried her tea into the living room and sat near the window. Outside, streetlights flickered on one by one. Normally, this hour felt lonely, but tonight her thoughts kept returning to the brief conversation at the door. She remembered Ethan's calm voice, the way he listened without rushing, respect in his eyes when she mentioned her husband. It wasn't attraction, she told herself firmly, just appreciation for kindness. Still, something inside her had shifted. For years, Margaret had moved through life carefully, protecting herself from emotions that reminded her of loss. She avoided new connections because they required energy, vulnerability, and the risk of caring again. But that afternoon had broken her routine in the gentlest way. She realized she had smiled more in 20 minutes than she had in weeks. The clock ticked steadily on the wall. She picked up a book but found herself rereading the same sentence over and over. Her mind wandered back to the doorbell, to the unexpected conversation, to the feeling of being seen, not as an elderly widow, but simply as a person worth talking to. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across her living room walls. For a brief second, she imagined another knock at the door and almost laughed at herself. "Don't be foolish," she murmured. Yet when she prepared for bed later that night, she noticed something unusual. She chose a nicer nightgown instead of the oldest, comfortable one. The realization made her pause. Why did it matter? She didn't have an answer. Lying in bed, Margaret stared at the ceiling as memories mixed with new thoughts. She remembered Daniel's laughter, their long marriage, the quiet promise she had made to herself after his death, that her romantic life had ended with his dot. It had felt like the natural order of things, safe. But safety also meant loneliness. She turned to her side and closed her eyes, expecting sleep to come quickly as it usually did. Instead, her mind replayed small details. Ethan's respectful tone, his thoughtful words, the way he treated her home as if it mattered. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship yet. It was simply connection. And connection, she realized, was something she had been missing more than she allowed herself to admit. Outside, wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn through the slightly open window. Margaret finally drifted to sleep with an unfamiliar feeling resting gently in her chest, anticipation for the first time in years. Tomorrow didn't feel exactly like yesterday. And somewhere deep inside, though she would never say it aloud, she found herself hoping the doorbell might ring again. Margaret Ellis woke the next morning with a strange lightness in her chest. The memory of the young delivery man from yesterday lingered in her mind, unexpected and uninvited. She told herself it was nothing, just a polite interaction. But even as she brewed her morning coffee, she realized she was anticipating another knock at her door. She poured the hot liquid into her favorite mug, watching steam curl upward, and caught herself smiling at nothing. For years, her mornings had begun with quiet resignation, the same routine repeated like a low hum. Today felt different, as if the air itself carried a promise she couldn't name. By late afternoon, she had nearly convinced herself she was overthinking. She had chores, books to read, and a few letters to respond to. But then the doorbell rang. Her pulse quickened before she could even think. It was him, Ethan, the same young delivery man standing with another package in his arms, this time smaller, lighter, but still somehow significant. His hair was slightly damp from the afternoon rain, and his jacket clung to his shoulders as if the weather itself wanted to keep him close. "Not groceries this time," he said, offering a small, almost shy smile. "Just a parcel, but I saw the address and thought, maybe you'd remember me." Margaret's lips parted in surprise, and her chest felt tight. She did remember him too well. She stepped aside to let him in, conscious of the strange flutter of anticipation that had taken root inside her. They moved into the kitchen quickly, almost as if the space between them didn't need words. Ethan set the parcel down carefully and looked around the room, noticing the familiar photographs and mementos. Margaret poured 2 cups of tea, handing one to him, her fingers brushing against his briefly. The contact was fleeting, but it sparked something electric she hadn't felt in years. They began talking, as if picking up from an invisible thread stretched across the week. At first, the conversation was light. The weather, the city streets, favorite foods. But gradually, it deepened, revealing fragments of life they had both carried quietly. Ethan spoke about his photography, how he loved capturing moments when people forgot they were being watched, believing that the unguarded self was the most beautiful. Margaret listened intently, drawn in by the sincerity in his voice, remembering the long-forgotten thrill of sharing thoughts with someone who truly heard her. "I used to work as a school librarian," she admitted, almost on a whisper. "I loved the children, their energy, their curiosity. It was chaotic, but joyful. It filled the house with laughter, even when they were noisy." Ethan nodded, eyes attentive. "You must miss it." "I do," she said softly, the words tinged with longing. He smiled gently, leaning slightly forward, his presence warm and comforting. "You're still needed," he said quietly. "People notice when someone makes a place feel like home." Margaret felt her heart stir uncomfortably at the compliment, the weight of his words reaching corners of her she hadn't opened in years. She had spent decades building walls, convincing herself that romance and excitement had passed her by. The thought of a connection at her age, especially with someone so young, was at once thrilling and terrifying. Over the next few days, their exchanges became a subtle rhythm of her life. Whenever he delivered packages nearby, he lingered just long enough to exchange stories, share laughter, or talk about the simplest of joys. She cooked meals with a little more care, opened old photo albums, and dusted corners she had ignored for years. Each small act seemed to be in preparation for his presence, even though she insisted to herself it was coincidence. One rainy afternoon, Ethan arrived soaked, and Margaret, instinctively concerned, invited him inside. They sat at the kitchen table, rain drumming gently against the windows, the scent of wet earth filling the air. She handed him a towel, watching as he dried his hair and jacket, and noticed the way he looked at her with a mixture of admiration and something more subtle, something she couldn't yet name. "I like talking to you," he admitted quietly, his voice nearly drowned by the rain. "You make everything feel calm, real." She wasn't used to compliments that weren't about politeness or flattery. These words carried weight, honesty, and unexpected tenderness. "You'll meet." That connections were supposed to follow the predictable paths society carved. Ethan's eyes held hers steadily. "Maybe," he said softly. The words struck her, lingering between them like a soft echo. Margaret realized that the thought of Ethan in her life, the possibility of sharing small moments with him, brought both fear and exhilaration. Their interactions, though brief and restrained by circumstance, became the highlights of Margaret's days. She found herself anticipating the doorbell, replaying snippets of conversation in her mind, and smiling at the memory of his presence even hours after he left. She noticed herself dressing a little more thoughtfully. These small gestures were no longer for herself, but for the possibility of him being there, sharing a quiet moment, a laugh, or just a cup of tea. One evening, after he left, she stood before the mirror. Brushing her hair slowly, she studied her reflection with careful attention, noting lines on her face and the silver threads in her hair. She whispered to herself, almost ashamed, "What are you doing, Margaret?" Her life had been predictable, safe, and controlled. Allowing herself to feel anything beyond the routine felt dangerous. Yet the warmth, the thrill, and the unexpected joy she felt at Ethan's presence were undeniable. She realized her heart, long dormant, had begun to awaken. Unsure of whether to embrace or resist the feeling, Margaret began to anticipate their conversations not as fleeting moments, but as small lifelines threading through the monotony of her days. They discussed books, photography, music, and memories of lives they had lived in separate worlds. Ethan brought laughter back into her home in subtle ways, like a gentle breeze opening a window she had kept closed. She noticed herself remembering how it felt to dream, to hope, and to feel her heart flutter at the possibility of connection. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Ethan arrived with another small package. Margaret, sensing a shift in the energy between them, offered him tea and motioned for him to sit. Outside, the clouds hung low, and the light was soft and muted. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean, reflective, and strangely intimate. They talked for hours about trivial matters. At first, then gradually about their lives, regrets, and dreams. The ease between them was surprising and unfamiliar, yet comforting. Ethan spoke of the people he photographed, of the stories behind each captured. Margaret listened, captivated, and in turn shared her own stories of love, loss, and the quiet beauty of a life that had once been full but had dimmed over time. She spoke of Daniel, of their life together, of the family and friends who had passed through her home, and of the lingering solitude that had become a part of her identity. He listened without judgment, without rush, without pity. There was a respect and sincerity in his gaze that made her heart ache and swell at the same time. It was a delicate balance of emotions, longing, hope, fear, and an undeniable attraction she could not ignore. When he finally stood to leave, the moment lingered between them. He smiled, almost shyly, and said, "I hope I can come by again soon." Margaret's hands were trembling slightly as she nodded. "I'd like that," she whispered, almost to herself. After he left, the house felt quiet, but not empty. Margaret walked through each room, noticing the light falling differently across the furniture, the softness in the shadows, the warmth lingering from the conversation. She realized that the shock of meeting someone new, someone vibrant and alive, had awakened a part of her she thought had died with Daniel. As she prepared for bed, she felt a mixture of emotions she could not fully name: excitement, nervousness, longing, and the delicate thrill of possibility. Her heart was alive in a way it hadn't been for years, and the thought both terrified and delighted her. Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining what future conversations might hold. She felt anticipation, curiosity, and the faintest hint of romantic hope. The quiet house seemed to embrace her newfound feeling, holding space for emotions she had long denied herself. For the first time in years, Margaret realized that life could still surprise her. that even at 59, love could enter unexpectedly, softly, like a gentle knock at the door. And she drifted to sleep with a heart that had learned it could still beat faster for someone new. Someone she hadn't expected but now could not imagine being without.